I'm a 35-year-old part-time housewife named Heather Ward. I've only been married for a short time, but up until lately, I was leading what most people would consider a happy life. I was unmarried, totally focused on my career, unconnected to men, and prepared to spend the rest of my life alone. I built a house 2 years ago with the secret hope of one day moving in with a family. But instead of just going unmet, that wish would be betrayed in a way I could never have predicted. My mother, father, older brother, and younger sister made up my childhood family at the time. So there were 5 of us. My mother, on the other hand, was flashy and excessive, but my father was quiet and polite. She enjoyed ostentatious attire and opulent living. Her vanity was lined with imported cosmetics, and her room was stocked with high-end purses and shoes. As a child, entering that room felt like a special occasion. In this scented space, I would secretly try on her lipstick or wear her high heels. To me, it was a small adventure into a glamorous world. I admired my younger sister Betty, who was 3 years younger than me. She was just like my mother in both appearance and personality. Even as a child, she was stunningly beautiful, drawing attention wherever she went. Her blonde hair, large eyes, and fair skin made her look like a living doll. Betty was always the center of attention, and everyone talked about her. As someone who looked up to our mother, I often felt envious of Betty, who resembled her so much and was cherished by her. Mom would lovingly comb Betty's hair and dress her in adorable outfits, treating her like a beloved doll. In contrast, my hair was always roughly tied back, and my clothes were purely practical. Even as a child, I felt a pang of sadness over this disparity. My older brother, Brian, who was 2 years older than me, resembled our father in both looks and temperament. Plain in appearance but earnest and reliable, both my father and Brian were kind and gentle. I was close to them from a young age. I remember how my father would always take me to the park on his days off. The warmth of his large hand as he pushed me on the swing remains vivid in my memory. Brian, after coming home from school, would always help me with my homework. His voice as he explained things was always gentle. We were an ordinary family until the day my father had a stroke when I was in middle school, and everything changed. That day, I came home from school to find my mother in tears. My father was rushed to the hospital and survived, but the stroke left him with paralysis on his right side. Before long, a man I didn't know started visiting our house in my father's absence. At first, he was introduced as someone helping with insurance matters for my father, but his visits became more frequent, and he started staying late into the night. It was clear he was close to my mother, but I was too afraid to ask her what it meant. The man wore flashy suits and spoke to us in a voice tinged with the smell of cigarettes. Though outwardly kind, he exuded a subtle malice, especially when the conversation turned to my father or Brian. Brian, a high school student at the time, worked part-time after school and came home late every night. I knew he was trying to support the family, but I felt lonely. I hated being in the house with my mother and the strange man, and I longed for Brian to come home early. But when he did return, he looked exhausted and no longer had the energy to listen to me like he used to. Betty, meanwhile, grew close to the man and was doted on by him. She would cuddle up to him, letting him stroke her hair while casting me a triumphant smile. Looking back, I realized Betty had already learned how to survive in this world. A woman's power lies in manipulating men, she once muttered with satisfaction as she admired herself in the mirror. Wearing heavy makeup. Despite being just a child, Her expression was eerily mature for an 11-year-old, and I remember feeling a chill run down my spine. One day, I overheard the man stroking Betty's head while speaking to my mother. "We only need Betty. The others are useless, just leeches at best." When I saw my mother silently nodding, my heart froze. At that moment, I gave up on attending college. It wasn't because I didn't want to study. I simply didn't want my mother to see me as unnecessary. If it made her happy, I decided I would work instead of going to college. But my brother Brian didn't approve of my decision. "I understand how you feel, but at least graduate from college," he said. Following his advice, I enrolled in a night college. Balancing work during the day and school at night was tough, but I appreciated having less time to spend at home more than anything. I'll never forget the smile my mother gave me when I handed her my first paycheck. "Thank you, Heaven," she said, hugging me. That warmth is something I still remember vividly. Seeing that expression on her face, I pushed myself to work hard every day. By the time I started working, Betty had entered middle school. Still resembling our mother, Betty shortened her school skirt and wore makeup to class. Even when reprimanded by teachers, she retorted, "What's wrong with wanting to look pretty?" Her attitude was a mirror of our mother's. By the time I graduated from night college, the man who had been visiting our home was no longer around. Apparently, he and my mother had parted ways after a fight. However, soon after, other men began coming and going from our house. Salesmen in suits, flashy entrepreneurs, middle-aged executives. They all started out polite, treating our family with care, but as their relationship with my mother deepened, their attitudes shifted drastically. They began to show outright disdain toward Brian and me. Every time I saw unfamiliar men's shoes lined up at the entrance, my stomach churned. Still, I couldn't bring myself to say anything. As long as my mother was smiling, despite everything, I wanted to stay in that house, close to her. Her flashy makeup, the scent of her perfume, her loud laughter, and the occasional tenderness she showed were all precious to me. Contrary to my feelings, one day my mother said something that pierced through me like ice. "You're in the way, so why don't you leave?" Her words were as cold as a knife. She chose her new man and Betty over me. It was devastating. But since my mother had said it, I obeyed and left the house. Having nowhere else to go, I moved to another state to stay with Brian, who had already left home. Leaving my hometown was hard, but I had no other choice. Brian lived near an industrial area in a small, outdated one-room apartment. That's where we began living together. Brian worked at a factory during the day and attended school at night. I started a part-time job at a nearby convenience store. I worked until early morning, returning home exhausted and sleeping through the day. This routine continued for some time. Eventually, I rented my own apartment and started living independently in that area. Although Brian tried to stop me, I continued sending money to my mother even after leaving home. My mother wasn't working, and my father had been hospitalized since his stroke. I wanted to visit him, but I was too scared of being scolded by my mother. I heard Betty had gone on to college. If that were the case, I thought I should do what little I could to support her. Every month, my remittance took up more than half of my salary. I worked overtime and took on extra shifts on weekends, whatever it took to keep going. I kept my own living expenses to a minimum, and I was fine with that. The thought of being useful to my mother was what supported me. For 15 years, I never missed sending money to my mother. Every month, I never saw her smile, nor did I hear words of gratitude. Whenever I called, It always went to voicemail. Even when I sent letters, there was never a reply. Still, I continued, it was the only way I could feel connected to my mother. During that time, I worked tirelessly. I started as an office worker at a small company, but attended night school to earn qualifications. This allowed me to switch to a better-paying job. There, I was entrusted with accounting work. My boss appreciated how diligently and quietly I worked. For once, I was glad that being earnest was my strength. I even built a house. Paying off the loan was tough, but I managed to make the payments each month without fail. Just as I decided to live a peaceful life, I met my current husband, Ken. Ken, who originally worked in a different department at the same company, came to mind as temporary help. My first impression of Ken was that he was like the sun. He brightened even someone as plain as me. I heard he had worked in another profession before joining our company. Ken was humble and respectful to everyone he met. I admired how he remained cheerful, no matter how busy he was, and tried to make those around him happy. Ken was always the center of the group, but he never imposed himself on others. Instead, he listened attentively and drew out the best in people. Watching him, I found myself drawn to him. Ken, in turn, was impressed by how seriously and quietly I worked despite being unassuming. One day, after a string of late nights at work, Ken handed me a cup of coffee. "Heather, you're always working too hard. You need to take a break once in a while." That small act of kindness touched my heart deeply. Since we were the same age, we naturally started talking more. Eventually, we began having meals together, and before I knew it, we were dating. 2 years after we met, we got married. Ken accepted me fully, including my complicated family background. "I love how serious and reserved you are, Heather. Even that little bit of stubbornness," he said with a smile. His words saved me more than he could ever know. After leaving my mother's house, I never imagined I would have a family of my own. At 35, I finally found a new ray of hope in Ken. Our wedding was small. On my side, only my brother and his wife attended. I sent invitations to my mother and Betty, but there was no response. Even so, Ken's parents and relatives welcomed me warmly. Ken's mother, in particular, treated me like her own daughter. For the first time, I felt the love of a real mother. I haven't returned to my childhood home in 15 years. The fear of being rejected by my mother has kept me away, even during holidays like Christmas. Still, I wanted to let her know about my marriage, so I wrote her a letter. I knew I wouldn't receive a reply, but I wanted to tell her that I was happy. During our courtship, I had already introduced Ken to my brother. When my brother learned about Ken's job history, he was initially a bit wary. However, as he got to know Ken's sincere personality, his reservations gradually disappeared. My brother had his own family, and since I got married, we'd spent time together as families. His wife was cheerful, and their 2 children were adorable. On weekends, we were often invited to my brother's house, where we enjoyed lively meals together. "Are you still sending money to Mom?" my brother asked me one day, a hint of concern in his voice. "Yes, I am. I send $1,500 every month. Ken knows about it too," I replied. My brother looked slightly exasperated, but I had no intention of stopping. I firmly believed my money was helping my mother. That belief kept me going every day. Still, my brother continued to look at me with worried eyes. One day, my phone rang. The caller was my younger sister, Betty. Like my mother, I hadn't seen Betty even once since leaving home. She must be 32 years old now. When I saw her name on the screen, my hands trembled with a mix of anxiety and curiosity. I answered the call. "Hey, sis. How are you? Long time no see." Betty's voice chirped, as cheerful and carefree as always. As she laughed brightly, it felt as though time had stopped. Her voice hadn't changed at all in 15 years. "I heard you got married. I'm surprised. Your husband must really be something special to choose you," she said. Her words were harsh, especially for someone reconnecting after so long. I stayed calm and asked her purpose. Her usual mix of sarcasm and disdain was evident in her tone. "What do you need?" I asked. She chuckled again, her laugh as grating as I remembered. I had always struggled with Benny. While she resembled our mother and was adored by adults, her arrogant attitude had irked me since childhood. "I want to celebrate Mom's 60th birthday," she said. "I'd like to talk about it. So can I come over to your place?" Her words made my heart freeze with suspicion. The last thing I wanted was for Ken to meet Betty. Whatever her intentions were, I instinctively felt they couldn't be good. "I'll check with my husband. I'll call you back," I replied, ending the call. That evening, I told Ken about the conversation. I didn't often discuss my family, but Ken knew that Betty and I didn't get along well. As expected, Ken said, "Why not let her come over? It's been such a long time, hasn't it?" While I appreciated his kindness, I felt conflicted. I was grateful for his understanding, but a lingering sense of unease remained. Still, knowing I had Ken by my side gave me courage. I decided to invite Betty over the following Sunday. To be honest, I wasn't looking forward to seeing her. From the tone of her call, she didn't seem to have changed at all. The days passed quickly, and before I knew it, Sunday arrived. The night before, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. What could Betty be planning? Why now, after 15 years? As morning came, Ken and I drove to the nearest station to pick up Betty. In the car, Ken tried to lighten my mood with jokes, making me laugh. His kindness helped ease my nerves a little. We parked at the station, and as I stepped out to wait, I saw Betty waving and walking toward us from a distance. 15 years had brought some changes to her appearance, but her walk and expressions were exactly as I remembered. She wore flashy clothes and bright red lipstick, resembling our mother. Betty wasn't alone. She brought along a male friend, Ryan. Ryan seemed to be in his late 30s, thin and carried an air of restlessness. Betty introduced Ryan as her business partner. After getting into the car, Betty began studying Ken's face through the rearview mirror. Her gaze held the same calculating glint that our mother used to have when looking at men. When we arrived home, Betty openly started flirting with Ken. "Ken, you're such a wonderful man," she said. "What kind of work do you do?" Her sweet voice layered question after question. Ken, however, remained composed and even shifted the focus to me, showing his care. When Ken placed his hand on my shoulder, I caught a fleeting sharpness in Betty's eyes. Then, out of nowhere, Betty brought up the subject of the house I had built. She claimed that our mother wanted to live with me. "Mom was so happy when she heard about your house," she said. "I can't believe Heather built a house." There was a manufactured warmth in Betty's voice. "We're family, right? Mom's always cared about you, you know." She just couldn't say it out loud. "Wouldn't it be great if Mom could live with you?" Her suggestion shook me. Could I live with my mother again after 15 years? Yet I also felt a strange sense of unease. If Mom was truly happy about my marriage, why hadn't she contacted me directly? Something in Betty's words hinted at ulterior motives. After that day, Betty began visiting me frequently, sometimes even trying to meet Ken alone. "I want to discuss work," she would say, inviting Ken out for meals. But Ken politely declined each time. Though I felt uneasy, I chose to trust Ken. "Heather, you're the only one for me," Ken would say, holding me close. His words gave me deep reassurance. Then the day of Mom's 60th birthday celebration arrived. Betty asked me to bring the deed to my house as a gift for Mom. "If you put it under Mom's name, she'll be so happy," Betty said. Alarms blared in my mind. That day, I visited Mom's house after 15 years. The exterior of the house looked the same, but there was a neglected, desolate feel to it. The yard was overgrown with weeds, and the flower beds my father had once cherished were gone. As I approached the front door, I heard voices from inside. Mom, Betty, and Ryan. I stopped in my tracks. "But Betty, you'll share the money from selling the house with me, right?" Mom said. "Heather's remittance isn't enough to get by," she added. Her voice no longer carried the strength it once had. There was a faint pleading tone that hadn't been there before. "Of course, Mom. We're family, aren't we?" Betty replied. "Besides, Heather will keep sending money. As long as you tell her you're struggling, she'll give you as much as you need." Her voice dripped with cold calculation. My chest tightened. Were my 15 years of effort worth so little? Had the money I sent every month only gone toward their indulgent lifestyle? And Ken is so handsome, isn't he? Honestly, Heather did surprisingly well for herself, Betty added, a tinge of jealousy in her voice. "But he doesn't budge at all. Do you think I've lost my charm?" Her frustration was evident. So she had been trying to seduce Ken. "No way. You're as charming as ever, Betty. That man's just a bit of a challenge. Have you ever dealt with anyone like him before?" Mom's tone, once so cold toward me, now overflowed with warmth as she comforted Betty. Ryan interjected, "You should give up on him. That guy's no ordinary man. Even I can see how guarded he is. It's like what?" Betty's voice cut in sharply. "Never mind. Just forget about Heather's husband. Focus on getting the house instead." I exhaled deeply, standing at the front door. Ken hadn't said anything to me, but he had deftly evaded Betty's advances. His quiet kindness hit me harder than ever. Resolutely, I pressed the doorbell. The chime echoed, and the conversation inside came to an abrupt halt. Betty appeared at the door. "Oh, Heather, were you here?" Her feigned surprise sent a chill down my spine. Her calculating nature lay just beneath her cheerful facade, clearer now than ever. When I entered the living room, my mother rose with a smile. 15 years had aged her. Her once heavy makeup was now faint, and streaks of white ran through her hair, but the calculating glint in her eyes remained unchanged. "Heather, it's been so long. Congratulations on your marriage. I read your letter. I'm glad you found such a wonderful man." She hadn't even responded to my letter, but I forced a smile. Deep down, I knew this would be the last time I saw her. "Thank you, Mom, and happy 60th birthday. I brought you a gift." Mom's eyes lit up. There was no trace of the warmth I once admired in her gaze. Only greed swirled within. I pulled an envelope from my bag and handed it to her. She quickly opened it and checked its contents. When she saw the copy of the deed, her eyes filled with tears. "Heather, such a wonderful gift." Even knowing it was an act, her tears tugged at my heart. For 15 years, I had worked tirelessly to see this smile. For a brief moment, those feelings resurfaced, but I wouldn't be deceived again. "Mom, "How's Dad? Is he still in the hospital?" At my question, her expression froze for a split second. Already knowing the truth, I could see her unease as clearly as if it were written on her face. "Yes, he's still there, but he's improving. By the way, Heather, can you increase your monthly remittance a little? The hospital bills are—" Mom attempted to change the subject. It was clear she was using Dad's medical expenses as an excuse to extract more money from me. A surge of guilt toward my father welled up inside me. "All right, I'll transfer $50,000 early next week. Please use it for Dad," I said. Mom and Betty's eyes lit up with greed. "Heather!" Mom hugged me tightly, tears streaming down her face. Her warmth was palpable, and the familiar scent of her perfume filled my nose. "Thank you. You're such a good daughter," she said. Even though I knew the embrace was insincere, tears spilled from my eyes. This would be our last hug. I knew I would never call her Mom again. 15 years of emotions came rushing out all at once. "Well, I should get going," I said, standing up and trying to suppress my feelings. There was no point in staying any longer. "What? Already? It's been 15 years, Betty said, her tone laced with dissatisfaction. There was a trace of desperation in her voice, hinting she still had something up her sleeve. At the door, Betty bid me farewell. "Come back soon, and say hi to Ken for me," she said with a suggestive tone that sent a chill down my spine. Her greed was no longer even concealed. When I got home, Ken was waiting for me with a warm dinner prepared. "How was it?" he asked gently. His voice broke the dam holding back my emotions, and everything spilled out. "It was just as I expected," I replied. Ken silently embraced me in his strong arms. I finally allowed myself to cry freely. I heard everything. I was outside the door, Ken said, gently stroking my hair. "It's okay. I won't let anyone hurt you again." That night, I told Ken everything about how I admired my mother as a child and worked tirelessly to earn her approval, about my complicated feelings toward Betty, and about the 15 years I spent chasing the simple hope of seeing my mother's smile, even though it was all in vain. Those years had made me stronger. Ken listened quietly, his eyes filled with deep understanding and love. Finally, he said, "Heather, you're not just someone's daughter. You're Heather. And that alone makes you amazing." Those words lifted a weight off my shoulders. At last, I was free from my mother and Betty. The following week, as expected, Betty called in a fury. "The $50,000 hasn't been transferred to Mom's account." Her voice was frantic, no longer capable of maintaining a facade. "I sent it to Dad's account," I said calmly. "What? What?" Betty's voice caught in her throat. "Wait, don't tell me. You don't even know Dad's account number? Weren't you supposedly taking care of him for 15 years? I heard Betty gasp on the other end of the line. Her composure was crumbling under the unexpected turn of events. "Betty, Dad is with Brian now. He knows you abandoned him. Brian took him in after that. By the way, Brian is now the CEO of a major trading company." "That's a lie." Betty's voice trembled, as if her carefully laid plans were collapsing beneath her feet. "And another thing, the deed I gave you was a copy. I still have the original. The house is already demolished. I'd rather destroy it than let you have it." "What? What are you saying?" Betty's voice shook as her ambitions came crashing down. "Oh, and one more thing I forgot to mention," I continued. "Ken used to work as a counselor for a private investigation agency. We have all the evidence of your fraud. The police have already been notified. The line went dead. The last thing I heard was Betty's panicked breathing, laced with sheer terror. A few days later, Mom and Betty were arrested. It turned out they had been running marriage and investment scams for years. The total damages amounted to several $1,000,000. Even Dad's insurance money had been stolen by them. Ryan was also arrested as an accomplice. Some people never learn, I muttered, sighing as I read the news article. Mom and Betty's photos were plastered across the newspaper. But it's over now, Ken said, wrapping his arm around my shoulder. In his embrace, I felt a profound sense of relief. Yes, it's over. But I still feel a bit sad. That's natural, Ken said gently. But Heather, you've got me. And you've got Brian, his wife. And our baby on the way. I smiled at Ken's words. After the chaos, I discovered I was pregnant. Now, I have irreplaceable bonds that mean everything to me. My brother's family, the new life growing inside me, and most importantly, Ken, my perfect partner. Hey, Ken, I said. Yeah. Let's build a house together this time. Ken's face lit up with a beaming smile. Of course, but this time, let's make a room for the baby. I buried my face in Ken's chest. This is happiness. Right now, I know I have true happiness. Sometimes I still think about Mom and Betty, but I have no regrets anymore. Those 15 years weren't wasted. Because of them, I now understand the true meaning of family. As I look at the blueprint for our new home, a quiet smile crosses my face. This house will surely be filled with warm light, and within that light, a new life will flourish. This is where my story begins, a story that is truly and uniquely mine.